Hello everyone, welcome to the second season of our project An Outside Opinion. My name is Oleg Rybachuk and I am the head of the Center of United Actions NGO. My guests are the ambassadors who represent the states of successful democracies and working systems of checks and balances. We are discussing the Ukrainian path to European Union, the reforms, recovery, and how the world security system should look after the war. Today, my guest is Alexandru Victor Mikula, the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of Romania to Ukraine. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to share Romanians' experience. It's not by chance that your country experience is very much, specifically nowadays, at present conditions, valuable for Ukraine. You started your European integration in 1995, and then it took you 12 years. If you could remember, what were the main challenges of Romania on the path to European Union?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And as you mentioned, indeed, the road to become a full member of the EU was not necessarily easy because we had a very complicated heritage from communist times. And I think that the main challenges we had to face in order to be able to join the European Union had to do with the transition from a dictatorship like Ceausescu's dictatorship to a full-fledged democracy with checks and balances and democratic institutions that are functional. We had previous experiences from Latin America of transition from dictatorship to democracy, but in our case we had also to have an economic transition. So if we had precedents regarding transition from dictatorship to democracy, we didn't have precedents regarding the transition from a centralized economy to a full-fledged market economy. So that was the second major challenge we had to handle in parallel with the political transition. Then you have the issue of corruption. The state institutions that we inherited from the communist regime were deeply corrupted, so we had to develop tools that are efficient in fighting corruption. And there were different tools that we have tested. Part of them failed, but part of them were successful. And the track record, the current positive track record we have in fighting corruption is based on the institutions that we were able to create and were able to fight efficiently against corruption. And of course, another major challenge is administrative capacity. To have public servants that are able to understand the acquis communautaire, the EU legislation, and to implement it into local legislation in an efficient way. It's not only of copying the legislation, you have to adapt it for implementation at local level and to take into consideration the specificity of each country. In our case, it was the specificity of Romania, but you will need to do the same here and to take into consideration the specificity of Ukraine. And of course, it's not an answer that is covering all the angles, but I would say that these four major challenges were the main explanation for the length of the process of EU accession in the case of Romania.
And how, in your opinion, Ukrainian path to Europe will look like? And what would be Romanian advice for us how to follow that road?
Well, I think that part of our experience can be useful for Ukraine because we also inherited heavy industry. From all communist times, you also have a significant heavy industry sector that need to adapt in order to be competitive on the EU market and internationally. I'm referring mostly to the steel industry, but of course, heavy industry is very often connected to the military industry. But the main challenge in our case is how to preserve the markets and how to be efficient, because the Soviet era heavy industry was relying on very cheap energy, which is not the case anymore. And of course, you have to adapt then to new technologies and also to environmental friendly technologies. But that's just a case, a specific case where our experience in the transition, in becoming a full member of the EU can be used by Ukraine. But you have also other areas like energy security, agriculture, which is also important for the Romanian economy, for the Ukrainian economy. So all the process of adapting these sectors of Romania to the status of full member of the EU and of taking advantage of what the EU has to offer while limiting the potential costs of the transformation to EU standards are important. Because, you know, we have to change in order to be able to be an important player within the EU context. And the EU and the EU member states have bilateral and multilateral instruments that are able to assist Ukraine in order to adapt itself. So it's a process, it's a win-win process, because indeed there are costs of adaptation, but you also have instruments that are helping you finance the cost of the adaptation, and at the end the result is generating positive results for the Ukrainian citizens, additional jobs, additional economic opportunities, and additional resources for the state budget so that they can be used for education, health, and other social policies.
Ukraine is constantly reminded that on the way to EU we have to implement a number of crucial, sometimes very challenging reforms. But there are voices also in Ukraine that we are at war. So do you think that reforms in the country which is at war are still necessary?
We have to understand that even if EU accession is a political decision, is based on clear facts. We speak very often about the fact that the EU accession is on a merit basis. Mm-hmm. And that means that in order to reach the moment when a political decision will be taken, you have to have the facts. So you have to have the realities, you have to meet the standards. So the political decision is not instead of the standards. You might have the standards and you still need a discussion on the political decisions. So that's just to explain why is that it is so important to meet the standards. The second part of my answer has to do with the fact that Ukraine has already a good track record of reforming the state institutions while at war. So I would say that the current government has implemented more reforms than all the previous governments in 30 years. So that means that it is possible to fight a war and at the same time to modernize the state. And the third component to my answer will be that actually by reforming the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian institutions, you're increasing the chances of winning the war against the Russian aggressor. So it is actually a mutually reinforcing process to fight the war and at the same time to modernize the Ukrainian state so that it is much more efficient in fighting the Russian aggressor.
There are still some countries which are demonstrating less will to support Ukraine. How should we respond to that challenge, and what would you advise for us to do? How should we act to counter those risks of declining desire to stay with us and to support us?
Well, as a diplomat, I can advise for dialogue. My advice will be to try to engage into a dynamic dialogue with these countries in order to see what is the result of misperceptions. And then the dialogue will be a reality check that could solve the problems that are based on the wrong information, the wrong image about what Ukraine is today, and what are also the vectors that have been spreading that misinformation about Ukraine. And in those cases where the dialogue is indicating a real problem, a legitimate problem for the partner, then to engage into brainstorming in order to see how can we find a solution that is acceptable for both for Ukraine and for that partner, so that you change from a skeptical opposition or for a skeptical attitude to a champion of Ukrainian integration into the European Union. So I will say that we shouldn't panic. We have to pay attention to see who is showing a certain reluctance in supporting full-fledged the Ukrainian case, and then to see what is the result of misperception and where is that you might find legitimate concerns, and then to address those legitimate concerns so that we can find solutions that will transform those states that are still a little bit skeptical, to transform them into ambassadors of the Ukrainian case in the different multinational organizations where they are present and Ukraine wants to join, being EU or NATO.
Is there any need to change decision-making process in EU, keeping in mind that this wave of enlargement is rather big? We are talking about probably 8 or 9 countries. And the threat that one of them in future can block the whole decision, it is a systemic threat.
Well, on the one hand, I should say that the negotiations regarding the Ukraine facility were complementary to the negotiations regarding the midterm review of the multi-annual financial framework. And actually, the main negotiations and the more complicated negotiations were related to the multi-annual financial framework. Usually, those negotiations last quite long, because we are speaking about reallocating in the middle of the exercise, reallocated significant amounts from one program to the other.
Yeah, EU budget cycle is 7 years, right?
7 years, but at the middle of the budget, you have this midterm review when you are checking the implementation of the different sectorial policies, and where you see that the money was not used.
And it could be reallocated.
It was reallocated to the areas where you have better use of those funds, a better level of accession, and so on. The idea is that at the end of the 7 years, you shouldn't have the money unspent on the priorities that the EU has established for herself. So that was the complicating exercise, which in this case was very short. I think that Moscow was very disappointed to see that it lasted only a few months and not a full year of negotiations. But that negotiation on the multi-annual financial framework has, let's say, delayed for, I would say, 2 months, the decision on the Ukraine facility.
It could be in December, yeah?
It could have been in December. That would have been the best case scenario. In this case, it lasted 2 more months due to the negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework. But at the end of the day, it gives sustainability to this instrument of assisting Ukraine, because now we took a decision for the next 4 years. We will look for instruments for additional support for Ukraine in the years to come, but at least we have an instrument that is valid for 4 years. And there will be, we are negotiating also other instruments, some of them that are dedicated to military assistance, some of them that will be dedicated to assisting the Ukrainian state in reforming. So it is important to understand that, of course, for us, for Romania, we would have liked to have this decision as soon as possible because of the urgency of the situation. It is important for the persons on the front line to understand that they are not alone, and there is someone abroad that is supporting Ukraine and is supporting what they are doing on a daily basis. And those are the EU, NATO countries, and the whole democratic world. Going back to the decision-making process, there is a discussion that started a few years ago about improving, making more efficient the decision-making process, but always with due regard to the interests of the small countries, the countries that have a small economy or a small population, or small economy and small population, because usually the system that is based on majority could neglect their interests. So in what we are trying to do within the EU family is to find a mechanism that will not allow someone to block without arguments a decision, but will take into account the interests of those countries that, due to the dimension of their population or of their economy, could be need to be, let's say, to have a special treatment, to be paid more attention, because otherwise the voting mechanism could undermine their strategic national interest. So we are still trying to strike the right balance, but for sure there will be an improved version of the decision-making process within the EU.
Well, there are like enlargement goes like in cycles, but this one is rather large. We are talking about like probably 9 countries to formally qualify for next cycle of enlargement, and there are such countries as Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, some Balkan countries, and this raises the issue. Some EU members raise the issue of how to avoid the risk of those countries making it to EU, how to avoid the potential of their regression. They can, on the way to EU, as a candidate, they can qualify, they can promise a lot, they commit themselves, but then getting a membership, maybe something in methodology should be changed in your view to make sure that like Ukraine as a new member of the EU could be a success story, but not be under the threat to regress and to weaken EU from inside. I'm not talking only about EU, but not only about Ukraine, but other countries. Do you discuss it among yourself? Is there any need to change methodology, or how to address that risk of new members making it, but then dropping enthusiasm, regressing on democracy, rule of law, etc.?
Well, there is always a risk to have in the future evolutions that are not, let's say, the ones that are the most progressive ones. And I would say that in the last 10 years, within the EU family, we have developed some mechanisms of self-screening and of addressing the potential shortages within the EU member states. Because if we do not fulfill our own criteria, then we are losing credibility in proposing and promoting those values outside the EU. And I would say that that has been one of the concerns of the European Union in the last 15 years, to be sure that once you are in the European Union, you continue to fulfill the criteria that allow you to access the EU, like the Copenhagen criteria. And the European Commission has used fully the instrument of infringement in trying to correct potential mistakes or negative evolutions regarding the rule of law or the respect for human rights. And in addition to the infringement procedures, we have developed this self-screening mechanism that is assessing the rule of law status of each EU member state. Even the ones that were founders of the EU are going through a similar self-screening process. And of course, if the reality will push for additional measures of let's say, sincere diagnosis of our let's say, compliance with the initial standards, we will be adopting new instruments in the future also.
How do you think Ukraine should institutionally deal with the changes in the current social contract within EU members? Because some EU members clearly have the fear that they would change their status of recipient of EU fund, and they would move into the category of contributors. And well, and that's rather painful because we are talking about big money, and Ukraine is getting on the side of recipients. So there is this fear among some of the EU countries. How do you think we should institutionally deal with this?
The process, even without the access of Ukraine to the EU, there is always a moment when the recipient
you have to change.
Will become a donor and that's also positive news. That means that from the point of view of the standards that country has when it comes to social affairs, economic, agriculture, transport, energy efficiency, and so on. When they have meet the average and
when
have
you reach
above,
certain level,
or you are above the average, there are some programs of assistance that you don't need anymore. So when it comes to structural funds, which were and continue to be very important for Romania in developing its infrastructure and in modernizing its economy and its public administration, I can tell you that the impact on our day-to-day life has been incredible. But we are aware of the fact that at a certain moment, Romania will achieve a performance that will not make it eligible anymore to continue to attract some of the money for certain programs that we are using today. And we will be migrating from those programs to new programs let's say, additional value added from our point of view. So the moment of truth will be, let's say, there with Ukraine in the European Union or without Ukraine. We will face that moment at a certain time in the future. So what I think that the Ukrainian accession is going to produce as an impact within the EU policies will be a modernization of the policies. Because the accession of Ukraine is being negotiated at the moment when we are preparing for the next multi-annual financial framework, the one that will start after 2027, and at the moment when we are already quite advanced in deciding in the modernization of some of the classical and traditional policies of the EU. And because of this coincidence and these parallel negotiations, I think that the integration of Ukraine in the European Union in the future will be facilitated. Actually, I think that those are two procedures or two processes that could enhance each other if there is a connection, if we build synergies between the two processes. And of course, we have to take into consideration also the negotiations we are having with the Western Balkans. It is important for the Western Balkans to take advantage of the momentum of the enlargement process, because with the commitment of Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova to the EU path, there is a chance of a different dynamic than the dynamic from the last years. And if they do their homework and they start implementing the policies they committed to, there is a chance for them to access the European Union sooner rather than later. So it is a boost of energy, of positive energy that we can use, and to generate these synergies between the current debate taking place in the EU about modernizing the European Union family, EU accession for Ukraine, Republic of Moldova, and the Western Balkans.
Ukraine and Romania, we are expanding cooperation in the defense sector, and there is potential for this. What prospects do you see in this field? And in your opinion, do we have also other areas for possible increase or for possible increase in cooperation?
I think so. I think that for Romanians, Ukraine was a mystery, and for the Ukrainians, Romania was and continues to be a mystery. And because of that, once we started to know each other, we discovered the potential of cooperation between our countries. And I would say that there are plenty of areas where we can collaborate, where there is huge potential of cooperation, starting with energy security, starting with our potential cooperation in the area of developing the infrastructure at the border of our countries. Actually, during our common governmental meeting that took place in Kyiv in October last year, we adopted the first master plan of Ukraine and an EU member state in developing the infrastructure at the border, speaking about new checkpoints, increasing the capacity of the current checkpoints, and of connecting these checkpoints to the national networks of road transportation, because it doesn't make sense to move the bottleneck from the border to a bridge or to a bypass of a small city. You have to do it in an integrated way. So this is already, let's say, value added that Ukraine is bringing to the table, and it will be interesting to see this kind of master plans developed with the other 3 EU member states at the border. And during the same governmental meeting, we signed a memorandum of understanding regarding the cooperation in the military industry, which is basically creating a framework that is stimulating both state and private enterprises to cooperate in the field of military industry. But we have plenty of other areas that we could explore. Digitalization is another area where we can explore our cooperation, because there are some things that Ukraine has done that could be a source of inspiration for us when it comes to the digitalization of public services. So it is actually a process which is enriching both partners in the process. And of course, there are plenty of other areas that, as I mentioned, could be explored in the future with a huge potential for bilateral economic cooperation.
What effect the war in Ukraine has on Romania and EU, and what lessons could be learned, what conclusions could be drawn from this war?
The first impact is the risk, an increase of the risk to the EU and to Romania as such, the impact of the humanitarian aspect of it, because we had to adapt very, very fast to the situation where millions of Ukrainians were looking for refuge in EU member states, including Romania. Then you have the geopolitical challenges with Russia that is challenging the international law. One of the permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations is breaching the international law, is committing crimes against humanity, is committing atrocities in Ukraine, and of course that has an impact on geopolitics. And of course it has also an impact on the way the EU has been looking to the security aspects. You know, the European Peace Facility was not meant for lethal weapons. And very fast, we have transformed that instrument in order to be able to assist Ukraine, even with lethal weapons and with military training on EU countries for the Ukrainian armed forces. So this is just an example of the impact of this conflict in the European Union and in Romania as such. And they will say that the EU is known for long processes of negotiations and decision making, while due to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the speed of taking some, let's say, strategic decision was so fast that I assume that it is still a major surprise for the guys in Moscow.
Yeah, that's pretty much the case. Okay, sooner or later, I hope sooner, we'll finish this war with getting Russians back to where they belong to, and then we have to recover, and we have to reconstruct our country, and that probably is by far the biggest potential project since probably World War II. So what Ukraine should do to maintain credibility or to increase credibility, to boost more confidence for those investors who would like to join this ambitious project of reconstructing probably the biggest European country in terms of territory and costs involved and projects involved. So it's credibility. How this credibility should be kept, or I hope even increased, what Ukraine should do.
Well, I think that the short answer to that will be that it has to be an Ukrainian-led process, but with enough guarantees and transparency for the donors to feel comfortable that the money they are investing is reaching the purpose. And the longer answer to that question is that the Ukrainian government has already started to do that. It is important that they didn't wait for the conflict to end before starting the discussions on the reconstruction of Ukraine, including the fast-track reconstruction and the longer-term reconstruction. And this is how they were able to develop together with G7 and countries and the EU. They were able to develop a platform where they are feeding in the projects of reconstruction that need assistance, international assistance, and the international donors that have established together with the Ukrainian government a governance body for handling this platform. The platform is co-chaired by the Ukrainian government and G7 and the European Union, with the presidency, the co-chairs of the G7 and the European Union rotating, and the secretariat of the platform is with the European Commission. Within the DG NIR, there is a special Ukraine unit, and the Ukraine unit is the one that is having the secretariat of the platform. And very soon it will become accessible for any person that is interested in knowing what needs to be rebuilt and who is assisting for rebuilding that process and how the process of implementation of those projects are happening. But of course, that means that the reconstruction process for a few years will continue to be a public endeavor. It will be mostly public money coming from states, and they will be leading the reconstruction process. But we need to prepare the moment for the transition when the private sector will take the lead in the reconstruction and of the Ukrainian infrastructure and of the Ukrainian institutions. And that we already started to work together with the Ukrainian government on that. So the first meetings were regarding the reconstruction of Ukraine happened in Switzerland, then Germany, then France. But already at the meeting we had in London, you had a significant component dedicated to the private sector. How to involve the private sector, what tools we could develop at the state level in order to assist the private sector to have the trust they need in order to invest in Ukraine, in greenfield initiatives or in rebuilding factories that were destroyed, modernizing their technologies and launching them again to production. So London has been the first international conference where we paid special attention to the private sector, but then the conference in Berlin this year and the conference in Italy next year will be dedicating additional resources and attention to the involvement of the private sector. And of course, it will be very important for the Ukrainian government to partner with the Ukrainian business community in order to continue to have the lead. So it is very important that the physical reconstruction of Ukraine and the modernization of the Ukrainian economy is a process that is being led by the Ukrainian state in partnership with the Ukrainian business community, so that the ones who know the best what Ukraine needs in order to recover from the destruction caused by the Russian aggressor are taken into consideration.
Yeah, and the last question, but probably the most difficult one, or important for Ukrainian security. War has demonstrated how vulnerable we are, how international laws could be, or international guarantees. In your opinion, what could be this sort of guarantees of security guarantees for Ukraine? How would you see that possible form of guarantees for the country which suffered unprovoked aggression of its neighbor?
Well, I think that terminology is very important in this process, and I think that the different ways of referring to disagreements are take into consideration the need to underline the fact that these agreements are not instead of NATO membership. That has to continue to be one of the objectives of the Ukrainian society, in my view, as an ambassador from a country that is a member of NATO, and we could see the benefits, the security benefits of being a full-fledged member of NATO. As a person who was involved in the NATO summit in Bucharest, and I continue to believe that my job as the coordinator of the NATO summit in Bucharest will be fulfilled only when Ukraine will be part of NATO.
And Georgia.
And Georgia also.
Was promised Moldova.
They still have to, to decide. But the idea is that these agreements have to respect the structure of the declaration of the G7 countries that was presented during the Vilnius summit. Mm-hmm. If you are looking at the 7 agreements that were already signed, you are going to see that the structure of these agreements are respecting the structure of the G7 declaration. And Romania, as being one of the countries that is negotiating with Ukraine such an agreement, will have, let's say, a product that will have a similar structure. But the main objective of these agreements is to deter future aggressions from the Russians against Ukraine. That's the main reason, so that the Russians will know that if they will try again, they will fail again, because there are already arrangements of countries coming to support Ukraine with whatever they can support. Weapons, training for the Ukrainian military on their territory, cooperation on the international arena, accountability. This is also an issue that we have to take into consideration, and we have to speak more about that, because it is important for everyone on the international arena to have the perpetrators, the ones that are responsible for this unfair aggression against Ukraine, responding in front of a tribunal, in front of a court, for the crimes that are being committed.